The ancient regime is the name used nowadays for the French system of government before the Revolution. It was first used in 1790 after the Revolution began, as an insult. The ancient regime just simply means old rule, old kingdom, or old regime. At the head of the ancient regime was the king. In theory, Louis XVI was an absolute monarch, which meant he ruled with no legal limits to his power and he ruled entirely with a hardened fist over his citizens. At his coronation, Louis XVI had sworn an oath to God, not to his subjects. Therefore, he was only accountable to God, he was made in the image of God, and therefore he was not criticised by his citizens because to criticise him was to criticise God. However, as powerful and as absolute and as in control as King Louis believed he was, in reality his power was based upon the consent of the noble elite, so the nobles of the court, the nobles of the robe, and the nobles of the sword, and he was bound by laws and customs of the kingdom that had been in place for centuries. He therefore did have to take into account other people's views, even if the nobles were very few in number. The king's government consisted of Louis, his advisors, and his ministers. And this was part of your holiday homework. So for the next few minutes, we are going to look at the structure of the king's government, that although he was supposedly absolute, in reality, you will see that King Louis XVI was actually constrained by those around him and could never fully rule as an absolute ruler due to these restrictions. The first group of people, or the very first people that Louis looked to in times of making decisions and planning for his country, were the people classed as his cabinet of ministers. These were a group of men who were seen as his trusted advisors, and therefore this group was very insular in the fact that it was largely made up of his family members, and it was largely made up by those who were the upper nobles, so the ones who lived in the courts at Palace of Versailles. Louis obviously couldn't run an entire nation of about 27 million people by himself, so therefore he had to give these ministers roles and he had to give them areas, just like Malcolm Turnbull does with his ministers. So he would place a trusted advisor in a particular area, maybe of their expertise, such as they might be good with funding, with money, so they were the Minister of Treasury, or they may have been very knowledgeable in military, so they may have been the Minister of War or Foreign Cabinet. Whatever it was, these trusted advisors were in charge of a particular area. They may have had expertise, or they may have just through their great friendship with the king and their manipulation got into that role. So therefore King Louis obviously, although he was absolute in theory, a lot of this power was going to these other ministers, and it was expected that they would do their job in a manner that would look and reflect greatly on King Louis. The problem with this group being so insular and mainly being made up of family members and those who only lived at the court meant that these people didn't see the outside world. They didn't see how the average person was living. Therefore, they were making decisions based on how it was going to benefit them and their wealth. The other problem with this group being so insular is Louis surrounded himself with yes men. That is, people were always telling him what he wanted to hear. Therefore, he was not getting any objective. He was not getting, his views were very biased. It was biased towards making sure that nobility in the royal family stayed in a position of privilege. Therefore, some unforeseeable problems clearly could be that King Louis is oblivious to what struggles are going on within his nation. He's not being told the whole entire truth, and therefore anything that the cabinet ministers did in ill would come back to haunt Louis, as the people would see him as not being competent in his role as their leader. Additional foreseeable problems with cabinet of ministers and King Louis and their very narrow view of what's happening in France is that the king did not meet his ministers as a group. He met them individually. Therefore, we know that one of King Louis's weaknesses as a leader and his personality trait was that he was indecisive. So it's commonly known that King Louis always agreed with the last minister that he heard and that he saw. This meant that it was Louis who decided the overall direction of government policy. Only meeting individually and not collectively also raised some other issues, such as it created a situation where ministers worked against each other rather than together. And one of Louis's problems was that he found it very hard to control the factions that were happening at the Palace of Versailles, the court. So a faction obviously is you have competing groups trying to compete with each other. So this made it much more difficult to bring in much needed reforms because he was trying to control the very group that should have been advising him in the best way to run the country. Another problem that King Louis and his cabinet of ministers faced was that there was a huge variation in laws and customs across France. France didn't have a single representative body. That is, they didn't have a parliament or they didn't have a congress, or it was just King Louis, his cabinet and ministers, and then that's where the laws were to be told from. So because France was made up of so many different regions and towns and cities, each town and city had their own laws, they had their own customs, they had their own definition of legal laws. They had different administration, they had different taxes, and they had different rules on who paid what taxes. So you can imagine that this bewildering complexity made France a really tough and hard place to govern. So no single solution to a problem could work in every place. It was different in one city to the next. Therefore, the king obviously realised that he couldn't have his ministers on the ground putting out his messages and going into the cities, and therefore his ministers also realised they didn't want to leave their life at the court at Palace of Versailles, so they realised that they needed to employ a group of men who would go out into society and deliver the king's message and also collect the king's taxes so that life in France could go forth. So the people that the king employed to deliver his message out within the public were royal governors. However, in the French Revolution, we call these men intendants. They were obviously chosen by the king, so it was a great honour to be chosen as an intendant. It was their role to go out into the provinces, the townships, the cities. They were directed by the cabinet of ministers, so the cabinet of minister of war may have needed some sort of message. Those intendants would be given that message and they would go out into society and deliver it and make sure the message got across to the French public. They spread the messages far and wide. They became the main form of communication between the crown. So when you hear me say the word crown, that obviously just means your monarchs, your king and queen. They were primarily from the nobility. A lot of them had paid to get into that role because it was a prestigious role. The other thing was they were the king's foot soldiers, so they got to see the everyday life, which meant the only way that King Louis knew what was going on in his country, because his ministers didn't go out into public, was to hear from these men. These men reported on what conditions were like, and here is your problem. Were these men reporting truly what they were seeing? Were they keeping it unguarded and away from the eyes of the king? They may have felt that he was too busy with his own day-to-day job. It also may have not helped them in their probably their will and their wish to rise up the ranks. Also, cabinet of ministers would have butted in and have told intendants not to pass on certain messages. And the other problem we have with the intendants was when they were told to take a message out, think Chinese whispers. When somebody's told a message, that message can change along the way, and sometimes the intendants would have used those messages to make sure that it prospered their situation in life and made their standing in the provinces and towns more formidable. In theory, King Louis XVI was absolute and he had the right to declare war on whom he wanted to declare war and hire and fire his cabinet of ministers and make decisions concerning the direction that his country is going. However, as said before, King Louis also had to respect certain laws and certain groups. So he had to respect the nobility. They protected him in times of war, but also the nobility is something he had to protect because they were also in charge of his magistrates. They were in charge of his courts of law. And King Louis's courts of law were called the parliaments, all right? So they were the high courts. They had over 2,300 magistrates. So these magistrates, these judges, effectively came from the nobles of the robe. So the nobles of the robe worked in 13 high courts across France. So there was 13 of these massive big suckers, big huge buildings where people would go and obviously challenge laws and whatever, but also the primary role of the parliaments was they were the government entity which released and scrutinised Louis's laws. So when King Louis wanted to pass a new tax or a new reform, or he wanted to get something made into law, he had to go through the parliaments. The parliaments therefore had a lot of power because they would receive King Louis's laws and his edicts and what he wants to make public, and they had the right to go through them and cross-check them. And if they found things that they did not agree with, they could produce a remonstrance, which was they could formally object against what King Louis was saying or what law he was trying to instigate. Therefore, remonstrance allowed the parliaments to point out problems. They could pick up King Louis on spelling mistakes, punctuation, the wording of his law or policy, and effectively they could block the laws and policies that he was trying to produce in the country. So one of King Louis's major blockers in the foreseeable future will be the parliaments, because they had the very right to be able to block his laws and policies and send them back to the king for him to review them. However, King Louis had one last thing up his sleeve, and that was called a lit de justice. That means when King Louis thought a law and policy definitely needed to come in, he could produce a lit de justice, and that was basically an overriding. He could override what the parliaments were effectively saying. He could force his decrees to become law. But this group will be a major blocker in the foreseeable future. And also remember, they are from the nobles of the robe. So when things don't go right for the nobles, they will object through this. King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had ascended to the throne in 1774. However, only about 6 years later, they were finding themselves in a situation that none of King Louis's relatives had ever had to face themselves. They were finding financial ruin. Years of borrowing and loaning and not being able to pay back these debts and funding wars, years of living a lifestyle that was unattainable, that was expensive, that was lavish, that was not with the situation and times of the country. Having a country where a taxation system was completely unfair because the burdens fell on one entire estate. Having a taxation system where it was chaotic. The form and process of tax collection was corrupt and mind-boggling unfair. Having a country that had experienced two major bad harvests when the main product of your country is agriculture. And finally, having a publication which effectively said that you were $10 million or livres, we call millions in France livres, in the surplus, in the green, to only find that with more research and more duty of care that this was entirely a book of lies and a fabrication of France's standing financially. So now we're going to explore why was France bankrupt by the 1780s when King Louis was 6 years into his reign. France had given the impression that it was quite a prosperous country by the time that King Louis XVI had come to power. And the reason that people were seeing this version of France was because it was quite a large nation. King Louis ruled over 277 square thousand miles. He had approximately about 27 million subjects. The land had been known for its fertility. The population was continually growing each year. The peasantry was getting astronomically large. It was at 22 million at this stage by 1780. We also had certain industries were thriving. France was becoming renowned worldwide for its trade in its wine. It was also becoming famous, probably through the exploits of Marie Antoinette, for its luxury goods, its fine fabrics, its amazing silks, and life appeared to be flourishing. But what was also adding to the coffers of the king and making the country wealthy and actually keeping it afloat was its slave trade. Now, back in the 18th century, great powers like Great Britain and France owned certain territories around the world through wars that they had effectively won. And France in particular, through its empire building, had acquired the Caribbean. Now, the Caribbean today, we know the West Indies and we call it Haiti. So France ruled those areas, and by ruling those particular areas, they were able to acquire the people that were on these lands. So therefore, they took in about 500,000 plus slaves. And that's very beneficial because with slaves, you don't have to effectively pay them. So you are making profits in nearly every aspect of your labour. So they used the slaves to labour and to help them make money off the sugar fields, the coffee and the cotton plantations. This sort of trade was very lucrative because sugar, coffee and cotton became commodities around the world that every other European power desperately wanted. So France was making quite a lot of money off the backs of these black slaves, as to speak, and by the 18th century, the trade had gone up over about 500%. So it was a massive trade and it was reaping riches for France. Merchants, traders, lawyers, bankers were profiting from Europe's appetite for the coffee and sugar. And as a result, this trade was keeping France financially afloat. But however, it was also making people realise its inadequacies, which is, think about it, merchants, traders, lawyers and bankers came from which estate? The third estate. So effectively the bourgeoisie were making the money for France and keeping it afloat. However, were they reaping benefits? One of the major reasons for why France was bankrupt by the 1780s was due to their involvement in wars. During a period of about 30 years, France had been involved in about 4 wars. But most notably, the wars which really created great debt for them were the 7 Years' War, which pitted France against its arch-old foe, Great Britain. And then we have the American, about 10 or so years later, we have the American Revolution, otherwise known as the War of Independence. And these 2 wars really put great stress on the coffers of the French finances. First of all, clearly the 7 Years' War went for 7 years. It involved nearly every major European nation at the time. What made it such a global war was there was 2 alliances. You were either on the side of France or you were either on the side of Great Britain. The reason for these 2 countries, if you do not already know, they absolutely hated each other and they still probably are a bit testy towards each other. But Great Britain and France had a great rivalry because they were both emerging nations. They were both emerging superpowers, They were both trying to expand their empires at a rapid rate, and also they were close in their own proximity. At this point in time, both countries were trying to claim more territories around the world, and the Africas looked enticing, the Americas looked enticing, but at this point, India also looked enticing. So France was trying to lay claim to India, which, if you don't already know, Great Britain had a major stranglehold on. So basically these 2 countries clashed for around 7 years until the victor was Great Britain. They had just outmaneuvered France, they had better equipment, they had better military tactics, and they managed to get a lot of those European nations on their side, which meant France really struggled and didn't have enough nations on its side to help prep up its military. As a result, France lost almost its entire empire, which would have been absolutely disastrous. They'd spent hundreds of years trying to build up themselves as a world superpower, and now, due to a war, they'd been greatly humiliated by their arch foe, but they'd lost territories in India and North America. However, one thing that they luckily attained was their slave industry in the Caribbean. However, they clearly lost thousands of men, military, money, but more importantly, this war becomes a sticking point because they were humiliated by their arch foe. And because of the 7 Years' War, we have their involvement in the American War of Independence. So America had freshly become its new own country. The people living in the states of America, were classing themselves as Americans. However, they were still, clearly they were run by the British, and we got to a point in time where the American people did not want to have any more British control. They wanted the British to get out, and they wanted to run the country the way they saw fit. So, of course, the British Empire said, no, we own the Americas, so there we have a war. Of course, we have France putting their hand up going, yes, we want to get back at our old foe. So America, we are going to help you. We're going to send troops to you. We're going to give equipment to you. But most importantly, we're going to give you something that we really don't actually have. We're going to give you lots of money. How are we going to give you lots of money? Oh, we're just going to borrow from all these other nations. We'll win the war. We'll help you beat Great Britain. And then down the track, you can pay us back, okay? So that's what happens. This war and the entry of this war is one of King Louis. He's 22 at the time. It's one of his first major decisions of king. So one of Louis' first major decision as king was to enter France into the American Revolution. By the time the American Revolution has ended, this war will cost France over 1 billion livres. So remember, livres is millions. By the time this war is ended, France is losing on average about 112 million a year, and this is becoming noticeable because the country spends about 411 million. However, they only make 377 million. So there is a deficit. France is just not getting on top of its loans, and the problem is all the loans that it borrowed to be part of these wars, all those countries are now demanding, we want our money. And we're putting interest, so that money is doubling. So this drastic decision was made by a young, indecisive, and easily manipulated king. So of course, we are now have our coffers do not have much, or if they have barely any money. So who do you turn? What do you turn to? You require your people to pay more taxes. Now, another contributing factor that was seen as being a major cause for the bankruptcy that France found itself in the 1780s was due to the wastefulness of the royal family themselves. Now, rightly or wrongly, not all of France's economic problems can be attributed to this group. However, they were attributed to this group because the monarchs, your king and your queen and your courtiers, the people who live at the Palace of Versailles, are living an outlandish lifestyle at this palace. And you've got to remember, in an age where Chinese whispers and secrets and and pamphlets and written documents were the only ways that people knew and heard what their king and queen were up to. And on a daily basis, they were hearing that Queen Marie was living a life of flamboyant parties. She was a major gambler. She was wearing about 6 to 7 dresses a day. She was getting in thousands of dollars of fabrics a week, luxury goods. There was an overflowing of wine. There are even comments that the Palace of Versailles, their water fountains were full of champagne. So all these sort of indulgent hobbies and sort of stuff creates a lot of salacious gossip and innuendo about the royals. And although the royals actually, in the whole grand scheme of things, they only accounted for 6% of the yearly budget, so that wasn't astronomically a large amount. Basically, as time goes on, they get blamed for the situation of the people, the struggling French people. Also, what you've got to remember about the life that they lived was just solely in fact of the Palace of Versailles. Palace of Versailles is about the size of 11 MCGs. It is huge, which means it had an astronomical amount of garden, and of course the buildings, every different king had built a different major monument or major structure or feature of the building, so the building was ongoing. Now there would have had to have been hundreds of servants, and you've got to remember that there was a village created around the Palace of Versailles for all the courtiers, so the very rich upper class nobles. So you have the upkeep, you've got to pay for all the servants, you've got to keep showing your wealth through building after building. So King Louis needed to show the monarchs of the Europe and of the world that his country was strong, and the way that he did that was making sure that the Palace of Versailles looked as a place of extreme wealth. Now, as I stated before, with all these rumours, we have a lot of innuendo about what the Queen is up to, and one of the most famous cases and sort of stamps on her character was called the Diamond Necklace Affair. Now, in a really quick nutshell, you should probably Google it and have a quick read of it. It's a really interesting, basically, little event that happens to the Queen. But someone pretends to be the Queen, and they are trying to get one of the most expensive diamonds in the world, and they convince a very wealthy archbishop that Marie is in love with him, and that for him to show his love, he needs to get her this great diamond. The Queen has no idea about it. However, when the archbishop is caught with the diamond necklace, he obviously shows all these writings that he had of the Queen, and he tries to prove that the Queen wanted him to gain this diamond necklace and spend these millions and millions. The Queen never comes out. Marie just thinks it's an absolute crock. She doesn't come out and defend herself. She thinks that the people are smart enough to know that she wouldn't do that. However, with all these other rumours of her lifestyle, the people actually believe that she did order this archbishop to get this diamond necklace in honour of her, and the people see it as just another example of her extravagance and another example of her careless factor for them. And she gets negatively branded with a nickname that she'll never lose, Madame Deficit. And effectively, Marie, as time goes on, will become the scapegoat for France's poor financial management. Needless to say, what about all the loaning and borrowing from the wars and the taxation system? Doesn't matter, it all gets pinned on her back. And there begins negative perceptions, and these negative perceptions persist and get even more grand, because there's 6,000 courtiers. She can't be friends with all of them, and some of them lose her favour, so they continue the gossip about her. And we've got to remember, we're living in a time where pamphlets are the main form of news, and just like you can pick up a paper today and see Kim Kardashian, Marie Antoinette at the time also had her name and face splashed every day across a pamphlet. Perhaps the greatest grievance that was expressed by the Third Estate, and in particular the peasants in the ancient regime, was the burden of taxation completely fell entirely on their shoulders. So therefore, the taxation system was something that was really for the privileged and very unfair. You have the First Estate, so your clergy, they're exempt from all taxes. They just have to pay a don grat, which is a present, to the king about every 4 or 5 years. Then, of course, you have your Second Estate, your nobility, who have to pay, if any, only a small amount of taxes. One such tax that they did pay was capitation, which was a tax placed on everybody in France, clearly except for the First Estate, according to their income, and it was only a tax that existed in times of war. So that tax may have only popped up every 5-10 years, and they had to pay it as a once-off. So therefore, they clearly only had to pay a small amount of taxes. Why did the first and second get away with so much? Well, remember, yes, King Louis by theory is absolute. However, he rules in a line with certain social groups, and the two groups that he needs on his side: one, he needs the clergy, because they give him divine right and say that he's all-powerful and that he should be in that role. And then, of course, he needs the Second Estate, the nobles, because 6,000 of them are nobles of the court, so they're his friends and his ministers and his family. They live with him. Also, he has the nobles of the robe who work in his parliaments and make sure that his laws become policy. And also he has his nobles of the sword. He needs them in times of war because they run his military. So that just leaves the commoner, the common man, the third estate, and they have to pay every tax that the crown issues. So the whole of the tax system falls entirely on one estate. Of that estate, you know that you have the bourgeoisie, and a lot of them are wealthy because they've made good money off the slave trade, and they're merchants and they're lawyers and they're doctors, so they're highly educated. However, then you have those two lowly groups, your urban workers who work and live in the cities. So when times get tough and bread goes up, they lose key part of their staple diet. And then you have 22 million, which is mainly the majority, complete majority of the country is your peasants. And your peasants have to pay every single tax. That is mind-bogglingly stupid when they make the least amount of money for your nation. So the laws that the third estate had to pay, there were three main types. They had to pay the tully, which was a tax to use the land and property of the noble. So obviously peasants didn't have enough money to own their own land, so what they did was they hired small plots. Of course, the land was owned by nobles, so they had to hire small plots off the noble. So they had to give him money just to hire and work on his land, so they come out of their yearly wage. The other thing that the third estate had to pay was the tithe, which is a tax which would take about 8 to 10% out of yearly wage, and they had to give that to the clergy, to the church, because they had to make sure that the clergy themselves were looked after. Of course, the upper clergy, your archbishops, took that money, and your poor lower clergy hardly saw any of it. And you had to make sure that the church's buildings were upkept and that their lands were tidy and that they did have money to give out for charities. But the biggest one, the real thorn in the side, the real hindrance on the back of basically the peasants, was feudal dues. Feudal dues were extra payments, extra money that they had to give the nobles. So yes, they're already paying to work and use that land from the noble, but they then had to pay for everything on it. That meant if they wanted to use the wine press or the oven or the mill, which of course flaps around and makes water and whatever, they had to pay for that to use it. The other thing was champart, which meant just to make enough, they're not making enough money, so of course they go hunting because they need to find their food. To hunt on the noble's land, they also had to pay to simply go out and kill a rabbit. So it was really these extra payments that really made life almost impossible and led to great hunger and famine and starvation amongst the peasantry. What also was unfair about the taxation system was how chaotic it was, how corrupt it was, how incredibly hard it was to collect money from the everyday person and make sure that money got back into the coffers of the king and the queen. So as you learned before, one of the main people of the king's government was the intendant, because obviously ministers couldn't get out into the public. So they hired intendants who were royal governors who went into the provinces and the towns, and they observed and they passed on the king's word, and they looked over the provinces for the king. Well, these intendants were in charge of collecting tax. Now, there's only 300 of these men, and obviously they can't service the whole 277,000 kilometres or whatever it was, square miles of France. So they needed to employ someone else to go into all these little townships to collect the taxes from the people. So the intendant employed someone called the Farmers General. And it was the Farmers General, which was a large group of men, there was about 300 of them. They would go into the little provinces and the little townships, and they would waltz up to your bourgeoisie, and they would go into the city up to your urban worker, and they would go into the real rural areas and go to the peasant, and they would demand the taxes and they would collect them. Now, this is where the process of corruption took place. You think about it. You're a farmer's general. It's your job to go to a peasant and collect some tax. You collect it. On your way, you think, rightio, I might just make a profit for myself. $1 for me, I'll give all the rest to the intendant. The intendant then, on the way to the government coffers, the government bank accounts, goes, you know what, I might just make a little bit extra money on the side. I'll give myself a few dollars. By the time it came to giving the money to the king and to his treasury, So much of that money had disappeared. So therefore, in turn, the king had to turn around and raise taxes again. So the system of taxation was chaotic. There was money being distributed from the person that's paying the tax to the person who's collecting it to the official person who takes it back to the king. And along the line, people were taking their own profits. So the system was unfair, chaotic, and corrupt. As a result of this system, you can see how members of the third estate, in particular your bourgeoisie, who understand the workings of money, who are highly intellectual, how they saw it as corruption, how they saw that the money being publicly funded and taken was being completely wasted, and they could see the corruption along the line. Clearly, the Crown is not raising adequate revenue, which means their debt's getting more and there's a lot more interest happening on their loans. Increased taxes are applied to make up for the losses. So when you're a peasant, you've already had a bad harvest. It's another stab in your back to have to pay additional taxes when you are paying your taxes in full, but other people are taking from you. So the third estate is continually burdened, cannot get a break from the poverty. And the bourgeoisie, they are immensely angered that the money that they worked so hard for, that the money that they have made off their own smarts is being abused by those in privilege. Okay, another factor which would have led to great discontentment amongst the major population factor, the 22 million peasants, was of course what results as a bad harvest. So we're going to have two really bad harvests in the French Revolution, one in 1781 and one in 1788. And clearly when your country is reliant on the agriculture industry, you need to have a good harvest, because a good harvest produces bumper crops, which means your peasantry then offload and are able to make their amount of money. They're also able to pay the taxes that you're placing on them. Of course, your urban workers are able to, they're shopkeepers and so be it, so they're able to sell the produce in their shops. Then their major staple diet is bread, so they effectively are happy because they're not hungry. And then you've got your bourgeoisie, who are your merchants and traders, and of course can trade some of your agriculture abroad. So it really is pivotal that France has good harvests. However, during these 2 years, they have savage storms, and these savage storms ruin their ripe crops. And we see it in our own world here in Horsham, what a storm does to the hope of farmers and what it does to the town, how it makes it quiet and people don't want to spend money. So all of a sudden we have, in particular these 2 years, we have a real grain shortage, which means we don't, obviously we can't make profits, but we also can't make bread. Now, this is an important fact for you to remember, but bread is the most staple key component diet of an urban worker and a peasant. The urban worker spends about half of its wage on bread, and the peasant spends even more. So bread is a commodity that the people of France just cannot live without. So when you do have a bad harvest, clearly prices go through the roof, and grain becomes astronomically something that is unaffordable for the everyday person. So, of course, when people are hungry, they will listen to more radicals, and they may just rise because the situation is so dire. Also, a bad harvest clearly leads to hunger, which leads to starvation, which leads to people being more receptive to revolutionary ideas. Hint, hint, that's how our Enlightenment is going to emerge down the track. But also, this has a negative effect for your absolute monarch, because remember, there are three beliefs about the king. One is that he comes from a legitimate line of rulers. Yes, he's got that. He's from the Bourbon dynasty. The other one is that he is competent, that he can produce for his people. A bad harvest signifies he's not competent, he's not producing. But also that he is benevolent. He is the father of the nation. So in times of a bad harvest, people do not feel like their king is being there for them and understanding their suffering. And also, another key thing is, a king supposedly has divinity, has God on his side. So when there is a bad harvest and a terrible storm, many people in a particularly religious nation like France will look and think, is this a message from God? Is God trying to tell us something about our king? Lucky last, another reason for why France found itself in financial trouble by the 1780s was purely because of what was detailed in a publication, and this publication was now a book of lies. But essentially, in the early 1780s, clearly we know that King Louis has a cabinet of ministers, and one of those ministers would be your treasurer, your finance minister. In particular, at this time, our finance minister is Jacques Necker, and he will be very key for what happens. He will actually be a catalyst for why the people will revolt at the fall of the Bastille. So you need to really understand where Necker comes from. First of all, the big thing that I want you to remember is he has the title finance minister. Necker was not a Catholic, and for that reason, a lot of people didn't like him working as the treasurer for the king. Marie Antoinette certainly did not like Necker, and because he was not Catholic, he never gained the title of Controller General. So we will refer to him as Finance Minister. However, after Necker is sacked, all other men who become the treasurers will be called Controller General, da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so that's just a little fact for you. Okay, so Necker was employed by King Louis XVI to help reform the taxation system. So it had been clear to King Louis that he needed some help in how the country was going and filling the financial coffers. So he gets this renowned Necker, this great man of finance and business, to come in and look at the books and tell us where we can improve. So Necker, after many months, pulls all the resources together and develops a document, and it's called the Compte Rendu. And what is revolutionary about this document is, with the king's consent, it is actually released to the public. So for the first time in royal history in France, the average person can now look and see where money is being spent in the country. So clearly, that would have been, of the day, a book or a publication that everybody would have wanted to get their hands on. So about 20,000 copies were sold in the first few weeks. But do remember, the main people buying this would have been your nobility, your upper clergy, and your bourgeoisie, because they were the ones who could afford it, and also they were literate. Definitely your peasants would have rarely have come across a copy of this, because for one, they wouldn't have been educated to understand its means. What is also a first about this document is it is effectively making the monarch accountable to his people. So people are now being able to read through this document and see what Marie and King Louis are spending at Versailles and in their parties and all their other wastage. So it's producing much talk about the lifestyle of the monarch and his courtiers, and it's going to make him be held accountable, something which an absolute ruler should not wish for. It's not one of his, it's something that he has never had to be made accountable for. So, of course, the Comte Rendu is a real bright spark and bright moment for France, because all of a sudden those nations that had been lending money, who are a bit hesitant to lend it anymore, are going, yes, you know what, this document says that they're actually 10 million in the surplus. So we'll just keep loaning them money because they'll be able to pay it back. So all of a sudden there's a lots of more investment in France, and people are again spending money. It shows that France is in surplus, which means it's in the green, and also it's something which is loved by the Third Estate, this document, because it states that the Crown won't need to raise any more taxes. So because of that fact, Necker becomes like a hero to the common man, because they see him as a finance minister who's come in, who's cleaned up the king's financial standings, and has boldly declared, we don't need to keep putting pressure on the average common man. So he's seen as a miracle worker, he's seen as a fixer, and because of what he's been able to do, people start to now reconsider and think, oh, maybe King Louis is competent, maybe he does see a clear direction for our nation. However, along the line, Necker makes some foes in the cabinet of ministers. Remember, we talked about before that there were factions, so not all the ministers, they met individually and they fought off against each other. So a lot of the men were backstabbing Necker, and Marie Antoinette, for other reasons, for the fact that he told her to cut down on her spending, also don't really like him, and we find that Necker is sacked. Upon Necker being sacked, we need a new treasurer. So we employ a Catholic by the name of Colon, so therefore he gets the title of Controller General Colon. He comes in, he goes through the Comte Rendu, pulls it apart into bits, and realises that the whole document is a fabrication of lies, and realises that France is actually in a worse situation than could ever be imagined. This is a complete shock to King Louis XVI, who for the last couple of months has ridden on the wave of, yeah, you've done a great job, the Comte Rendu is a fantastic document which highlights our wealth. And now King Louis realises he's going to have to break it to his nation that I do need those taxes, I do need to go out to you and acquire more wealth off you because we are bankrupt. We have to pay back more loans. We're stupidly taking more loans under Necker. Now what are we to do? So Colon really realises that the only way forward is for King Louis to reform the taxation system, the collection, and who pays taxes. So the Comte Rendu is going to make all future attempts at taxation reform really difficult because a lot of groups in society are going to say, no, the Comte Rendu said we're in the plus. How dare you tell us that we're in the red?
Since the Middle Ages, European society had been broken into three distinct classes, dictated by birth. There was a great divide between the wealth of the nobility and the clergy, and the poverty of the peasants. Then, at the blossoming of the 18th century, reason and science began to challenge this age-old tradition. Swept up on a current of innovation and new literature, Paris now radiates as the philosophical center of the world. The city pulses with a great flourishing of knowledge, a shining beacon of possibility. It is the age of enlightenment.
The Enlightenment is a movement which says don't trust authority, don't trust anything that you've been told by anybody else at all. Think it out for yourself, test it for yourself.
In old regime Europe, you were told what to think. You were given information from above by your rulers, by your priests. And so the idea that you could map out all of human knowledge and then have access to it was revolutionary.
In elite salons across Paris, aristocrats gather to discuss Enlightenment authors and the burgeoning age of reason. Voltaire, Rousseau, fresh voices who champion liberty, control of one's own destiny, and above all, equality. The passion for this new literature is highest among the upper class, but as Enlightenment ideas take root at all levels of society, the drive for equality will begin to threaten the aristocratic way of life.
What makes it dangerous is it means you will eventually question, why are aristocrats the ones with privilege? Can't we change the world to make it a better place? Isn't progress possible? All of that will eventually undermine the idea that monarchy is natural, aristocracy is natural, and hierarchy.
What are the things we value most about our modern world? Freedom, to enjoy ourselves, to argue and discuss, to express our views, to find things out, to read and write, and the science and technologies that make these possible. None of this happened by accident. These freedoms were won through courage and with vision in an extraordinary period of human history. It began in 17th century Europe. It was called the Age of Enlightenment. In the space of little more than a century, religious faith yielded to reasoned argument, and the power of aristocracy gave way to the power of knowledge.
Frankreich im 18. Jahrhundert war das, was wir heute ein repressives Regime nennen würden. Und tatsächlich Menschen, die etwas diskutieren wollten, die Ideen diskutieren wollten, die vom Staat nicht sanktioniert waren, mussten zu so einem Ort kommen wie diesem, zu einem Salon. Voltaire hat seine Karriere in so einem Salon begonnen und dort haben sie neue Ideen, Ideen von einer unglaublichen Radikalität diskutiert und entworfen und haben tatsächlich eine ganz neue Weltordnung geplant.
Despite its repressive laws, Paris was becoming a prosperous and exciting city, a magnet for ambitious young men from the provinces, hoping to succeed by their wits. One of them was this man, Denis Diderot. Unlike Voltaire, Diderot wasn't a member of the aristocratic elite. His great work was France's first encyclopedia, the engine of the Enlightenment. But he'd barely begun when another of his works was noticed by the king's censors.
1749 fand sich Diderot in einer Zelle im Château de Vincennes, vielleicht in dieser. Er hatte es gewagt, ein Buch zu schreiben, in dem er behauptete, Wissen käme von den Sinnen, nicht aus göttlicher Offenbarung. Für den König war das Provokation genug, um ihn hier festzusetzen. Obwohl Diderot im Hochsommer festgenommen wurde, brachte ihm sein Kerkermeister jeden Tag 2 Kerzen. Nach einigen Tagen sagte er dem Kerkermeister, er könne sie wieder mitnehmen, er brauche das nicht, das Licht sei gut, es sei Sommer. Aber der Kerkermeister sagte ihm, behalte sie, du wirst sie vielleicht während der langen Winterabende brauchen. Erst da wurde ihm klar, dass er hier vielleicht saß für Monate, Jahre, je nachdem, wie lange der König ihn behalten wollte.
But the worst thing about imprisonment for Diderot was that it was keeping him from the great project of his life, the Encyclopédie, which he'd barely begun when he was thrown into jail. His idea was to bring together the finest minds of the day and produce a series of books that would include not only philosophy and ideas, but also craft and trade skills, explained in every detail. Until then, useful knowledge like this hadn't been thought worth recording. But Diderot and his colleagues sought out the ordinary people, to whom nobody had previously listened.
Die Behandlung der handwerklichen Tätigkeiten selbst war ein Programm der Enzyklopädie. Es hat die Handwerker sehr aufgewertet in einer Zeit, in der eigentlich nur Aristokraten einen Wert hatten. Und das kommt natürlich auch daher, Diderot kam aus Langres, also eigentlich aus der Provinz, aus der Champagne. Und da war sein Vater ein Messerschmied, der hat Klingen geschmiedet und war sehr gut in seinem Beruf, wollte eigentlich auch, dass sein Sohn ihm nachfolgt. Aber er hat es eine Woche lang probiert und er hat es wirklich nicht gewollt und er hat es wirklich nicht gekonnt. Aber er war stolz auf seinen Vater. Er war stolz auf das Handwerk, er war stolz darauf, dass jemand etwas mit seinen Händen produzierte. Und das ist natürlich auch genau das Gegenteil von den Priestern und Aristokraten, die Frankreich tatsächlich beherrschten.
Even imprisonment didn't discourage Diderot as he planned his Encyclopédie, nor did it tone down his radical intentions. But he realized it would outrage the authorities, especially the church.
Sie durften nicht zu subversiv sein. Man muss sich erinnern, damals wurden Menschen nicht nur eingesperrt für das, was sie sagten, sie wurden tatsächlich auch noch hingerichtet, manchmal wahnsinnig grausam hingerichtet.
With the stakes this high, Diderot had to be ingenious in outwitting the censors.
Hier zum Beispiel ist das Système de Connaissance, also eigentlich das System des ganzen Wissens. Und wenn Sie sich das ansehen, dann sehen Sie, ganz oben ist die Theologie. Das haben die Zensoren sicherlich gemocht.
But right below religion is black magic. Even the sequence of entries in his Encyclopédie held hidden meaning. His world had no place for belief in any god at all. he hid his attacks on the church throughout the whole work, even in a system of cross-references, like one which links the Eucharist with cannibalism. His wit and daring attracted friends as well as enemies, and luckily for Diderot, they included the king's mistress, Madame de Pompadour. She was even painted with her own copy of the Encyclopédie. With such friends in high places, after 3 months in prison, Diderot was released. The king and the censors had realized that Diderot's great project had become an industry in itself, and potentially a very profitable one. Despite continuing harassment from the church, Diderot and his colleagues were consumed for the next 26 years in bringing their great work into being. There were 20 million words in 28 volumes, and every letter of every word had to be set by hand. Hundreds of typesetters, tanners, printers and bookbinders were involved.
Diderot hatte einen hohen Preis bezahlt für seine Arbeit an der Enzyklopädie. Er war 3 Monate eingesperrt gewesen, aber in 1751 konnte er sie endlich in seinen Händen halten. Da war der Tome Premier und es war ein gigantischer Erfolg. Und tatsächlich einerseits seine Inhaftierung und andererseits die Enzyklopädie selbst machten ihn zu einem berühmten Mann, erreichten also das, was er wollte. Er bekam einen Brief von Voltaire, der ihm gratulierte, der ihn den modernen Sokrates nannte.
Diderot's vast enterprise finally achieved his ambition, bringing respect and recognition to ordinary people. But most of them had little chance of reading about it.
The Encyclopédie was a very expensive book. It actually cost something like 980 livres, which, if you put that into the context of the time, a skilled artisan, if he was lucky, might earn something like 15 livres in a week. So he could never have afforded this. It was mostly bought by members of the social elite, the crème de la crème.
And even for those who could, buying any book remained a risky business.
Something like half the books that were published in France during the 18th century were banned books. They were sold under the counter secretly, and even the Encyclopédie was banned for a number of years. But Diderot said, a book banned is a book read.
Diderot realized that the controversy was helping to publicize the Encyclopédie. And despite the risks, its success started a huge boom in publishing at the time. The excitement of access to ideas, to information, to the wider world consumed society at all levels, as even ordinary people learned to read. Diderot's great dream of giving all knowledge to the world was becoming reality. But the Church was fighting back. Its supreme leader, the Pope, condemned the Encyclopédie and ordered it burned. He declared that any Catholic who dared to read it would face eternal damnation.